Hello again. I was here before for disruption. Now I'm here for crisis. I don't know what it is about me. Anyway, just when faculty and administrators were almost complaining that students seemed complacent, the last few years have brought us a lot of protest and dissent, new student activism on campus around hate crimes and free speech, issues of racial and social justice. Even things like Halloween costumes have been remarkably controversial and set off a lot of protests. And then we have the time-honored controversies around alcohol abuse and sexual assault. So there's a lot going on campus. Ajay, you talk about the demand culture and students not only bringing their megaphones, but also their lists of demands. But I want to start with Julia a little bit to talk about the response, right? Julia is an agency, she often arrives as maybe the third agency on campus when things have gone really, really bad, and you're sort of not only cleaning up administration mistakes, but also mistakes of previous administrations and trying to turn around bad perceptions and bad PR. So just to start with a somewhat provocative question, what's the worst response you've ever seen? What's the biggest
worst response? Wow. So I think, I think the worst responses kind of come from a category of behavior, so I'm not going to call anybody out. As a matter of fact, I think any of us would. And so I think the worst thing that sometimes we've seen is a kind of a response to a percolating issue that tends to kind of go back a little bit to, I guess, would you say, old school planning and old school response. And by that I mean, so many of campus leaders still are kind of in the boomer category. Maybe some of the rising, millennials are making their way in. But so many of us tend to want to go to the academic response of precise language, of well thought through information, of comprehensive collaboration among leaders on campus to make sure that what we say is representative of the institution, which is all well and good, but there's a difference, and I think there's a challenge in terms of being fast and right at the same time. So I think that Sean Harper got it right. He said some of the most compelling challenges or that we've seen over the last couple of years have been from a perceived lack of responsiveness early on as the issue unfolds. So you kind of run through your mind as to kind of some of the biggest issues that we've seen, a lot of times they came from a perception of a lack of responsiveness. And we all know that the administration is kind of in a room somewhere trying to respond and figure out what to say. But it is that perception, I think, that causes the biggest challenge.
So you can't go into a boardroom and emerge 2 days later?
No, you can't come into a boardroom and emerge with a perfectly wordsmithed, response as a first thing, right? There are other things that you can do first and should do first.
Do you feel like there is an amount of time that you have? Like what is in our...
Well, if you judge by kind of the type of time frame that will happen, it really kind of depends on the challenge and the issue that you're facing, right? Some of them are very localized and very strong voices within a local community and not in a large urban media center are going to have a little bit of a different bit of time. But I will tell you that in the biggest crises that happen, they can go global via social media in less than 11 minutes.
It's pretty scary.
So it changes everything. It completely changes everything in terms of how you think, how you plan, and how you prepare.
Right. If I could just add, too, the idea of sweeping things under the rug no longer works, right?
Right.
That we have to be able to respond quickly to these matters and frame it through doing the right thing.
Right.
And I think for higher ed, that's critically important.
So I want to come back to that, and particularly to the social media piece. But Ajay, I want to talk to you first have you tell us a bit about how Emory as a university has structured itself to sort of respond rapidly and prevent these crises from escalating. You call it, I think, enterprise risk management. And can you tell us a bit about how that system worked and maybe didn't work when you had Black Lives Matter protests on campus?
Sure. There was a pivotal moment for us at Emory during the Black Lives Matters movement when a student asked the university administration in a very public forum whether or not we were serious about racial justice. And she went on to say, if you're not serious, let's just stop these conversations right now. And of course, I wanted to emphatically say, yes, of course we're serious about it. It's a priority for us. But I couldn't say that with full confidence. What does it mean for racial justice to be a priority in higher education today? Is it a priority like research is a priority, like teaching is a priority, like fundraising is a priority? And the answer was it wasn't. And so when we started asking those questions, what does it mean to prioritize racial and social justice? Of course, in higher ed, it raised even more questions, right? For instance, what are the values and principles of the institution? How does power operate at the university? How are resources being deployed? And if we know that many of our practices haven't been working to begin with, why do we keep doing them? Why don't we venture out and create best practice? And so it sparked a whole lot of conversations, and from there, we developed systems to address racial injustices, social injustices. And we modeled it after, interestingly enough, systems that work. Many of your institutions probably have an enterprise risk management system. For Emory, we're pretty well known for that system, and we tried to replicate that system. It's somewhat bureaucratic, right, but it works to address racial and social injustices. And we developed a set of priorities based on the Black Lives Matter's demands. We unpacked those demands with the students, and as Sean Harper mentioned earlier, we created a set of working groups with the students to address those issues and address systemic issues. Many of us tend to put Band-Aids on really, really challenging problems, but really to delve deep, unpack the issues, and develop long-term strategies, timelines, accountability measures, and action steps. All of it is very transparent. We have a website dedicated to it, dialogue.emory.edu, where the whole community, the entire world can read about what we're doing, where we failed, where we've had successes.
And this same model applies to, say, you know, if you have an issue of alcohol abuse or sexual assault on campus, does that model then apply to other crises as well?
It could. We haven't done that. We made a commitment to the students that were part of the Black Lives Matter movement to first focus on racial justice,
right?
Because they didn't want the issues to get watered down, right? But I do think that over time we will venture out. For instance, I'll give you an example. Many of us are dealing with the sanctuary campus issues of undocumented students. We have made a decision to tackle the issues surrounding student success, undocumented students, through this process. But we haven't made the decision around sexual violence prevention or alcohol and other drugs, but that time could come. We want to have real success with the issues that we're tackling right now before we venture out into new crises.
And again, talk a little bit about the timelines that we're working with. Like, how long do you, I mean, I think we talked a bit about this morning, sort of the university tendency to set up a committee and go into bureaucracy. Sure. And how long does all this take to get students in, to make them feel part of the conversation, to get faculty and administration on board? What's the time frame?
So there are many issues that we can tackle immediately. There's quote unquote low-hanging fruit, right, that we can make quick progress on. And then there are issues like the curriculum, right? Our students were calling for diversity in the curriculum, and we know that the students actually learned very quickly that the president of the university or the dean can't just make that happen, that faculty governance drives that. That was news to our students. So there was an educational process that came about through working with students on that demand. And we were realistic in our timeline, right? That it wasn't going to be a semester or a year, that perhaps it's going to take 2 years to fully develop strategies. And in the end, we still may not have a diversity requirement, but we would at least have addressed the issue in some creative way to ultimately fulfill what the students were asking for.
And how did you make that clear to the students? Is it enough to just tell them up front?
So we asked for student participation in a number of working groups. So for faculty and the curriculum, we had the chair of the faculty senate along with a faculty champion, a well-respected faculty member, working with administrators and students, meeting regularly. And they would develop strategies to do this, and they would report back to a larger group of stakeholders, including the president, including deans, and the president and the deans would then appropriately resource whatever action steps needed to happen.
Right.
There's a commitment on the part of the institution to make that happen.
So on the Emory campus, you're sort of the person tasked with responding to this. Julia, can you talk about, is it important to sort of designate one person to be your liaison, to use a big word,
well,
use an overused word?
So it depends on the topic and issue. I think the most important thing, there's nothing that can substitute kind of thinking through in advance. Who is the team going to be? And kind of if you ladder back to thinking about how leaders can think through and prepare for this, I guess my first statement is that really, most universities feel they're pretty well set with an emergency response plan, right? So we know what would happen if, God forbid, there is some type of physical emergency on campus.
A Virginia Tech situation.
Exactly. Something, where we've got the chief of police or somebody that is going to come in and respond. Many campuses don't have a different type of plan, which has to do more with issues that kind of impact further dialogue or reputation of the institution. So reputational plan is real important in terms of understanding what happens when you get an invitation to come speak before Congress about, the way that, diversity and the way that athletic teams are treated and all students created equal, under Title IX. Who responds and how? So I think the first real good step is to put in place a team that is thinking about those things, paying attention to where there may be particularly important issues that the institution needs to address. And then from there, as a leader, as an institutional leader, particularly at the president level, you need to know who is going to be on your team to respond to what things. So it'll be different for each topic, and put your plan in place that way.
Right.
Yeah.
I want to, because this was very interesting to me talking to you beforehand, both of you, the role of social media, right? So why don't you talk about both what you think, maybe again starting with you, Julia, about the expectation that students have versus what administrators think they're supposed to do?
This is perhaps, I think, one of the most interesting things, and if you track very carefully some of the evolution of the issues that you all are dealing with, you will come to see, and most of you already know, that social media continues to be, in many cases, the driver of the conversation. But I think we spend a lot of time working with university leaders, and one of the things I think that is interesting is, again, as boomers, I think there are many leaders who don't quite understand kind of the current social mindset of Gen Z, which we'll talk more about, I think, after this session, but in how they think about conversation. Interestingly enough, Gen Z really believes that everybody's listening all the time. And they believe that, therefore, if you as a leader or a university are not responding, it's because you're intentionally not responding. So some research that we've done shows that as many as 20% or more of academics are not on social media at all, which is fine. We're not saying that you need to be. But the gap between those leaders and academics and teams that are tuned into the listening of social media and the percentage of those students that are actively having the conversation, I think that gap is one that is absolutely where an appearance of unresponsiveness happens, right? So the most important thing is to remember that social media now is the place where the conversation happens. And so therefore, talking about teams, some of the advice that we really do strongly give is to understand social media as a listening tool as much as it is a publishing tool. So as a leader, remember that. Does it mean every single leader needs to be on social media? No. If it is authentic to you as a leader, yes. Although communications people around the world are going to go, no. But nonetheless, it depends on the authenticity of your leadership. But most importantly, empower those who are responsible for social media. Oftentimes still at many campuses, you will see the social media person is a recent graduate. We're like, oh, great, got somebody that understands Instagram. We're going to put them in, and we're going to kind of give them the run of not the run, but ask them to monitor social media for us, which is all good. But one of the best social media managers at a Big Ten university at a recent conference said, in a crisis, your social media manager is your chief communications officer. So remember that that role is becoming increasingly, critically, strategically important to leaders. And I would strongly encourage, and we are strongly encouraging, the elevation of that role very close to the leadership suite as especially crises are monitored or responded to.
So Ajay, what platforms are you on, and how are they different? How do you respond to different audiences through different platforms?
Yeah. Let me just add to that, that in the absence of sites to negotiate conflict outside the classroom, in the absence of building spaces where students can discover new ways of knowing and understanding, students are going to create their own spaces, usually on social media.
Right.
And so I think we have a deep obligation as higher ed institutions to create those spaces for students where they can have conversations live, right, with each other in person. I happen to be on virtually all the platforms, not to monitor what students are doing at all, but to have a pulse of what's happening in the community. And so, and it's very helpful. I mean, I think someone on your campus and your leadership team needs to be able to do that. And it's not as though everything on social media, as you know, is truth. But certainly it gives us a sense of what students are talking about, and then we can bring students together in person to actually share with them, at least from our perspective, what the truth is. Right. And have real dialogue and real conversations. But if you don't create those spaces, they're going to create them, and the narrative completely shifts.
And you mentioned, so you mentioned to me that students and their organizations tend to be on Facebook, whereas who's on Twitter? Maybe it was Julie who said this, that journalists are seeking your response on Twitter, whereas the students are looking for you on Facebook, so you really have to vary your...
Yeah, we may be surprised. I mean, at least on Emory's campus and other campuses that I've been a part of, Facebook has become the primary vehicle for students' activism, right? To express their concerns, where Instagram, Snapchat, even Twitter to some degree, are spaces where their sort of private lives right, are being sort of displayed. But Facebook, in many ways, because it's somewhat outdated and folks like us that are using it, that's where they're trying to get our attention. Right. And you don't really see their private lives displayed as much. Right. So yeah, Facebook is the primary tool, and you know, almost every day my name is in some feed just to get my attention about a particular issue. It could be a dining issue, could be an activist issue, a student health issue, because they know I'm on it, and that it's easier than sending an email, I suppose.
Yeah. We're going to move to questions in a second, so everyone wants to prepare, but just briefly before we go to that, tell me about the role of your debate team and the student newspaper. You had an interesting... Yeah.
Well, you know, Emory doesn't have a football team, but we have a world-class debate team. Right. They win national championships, and it's our point of pride. When I came to Emory 5 years ago, the debate team was winning, and they were doing quite well, but they weren't really engaged in our own community. And given all the challenges we have about actually sparking conversation on campus, I call it the sort of impossible conversations that we want to have, we weren't utilizing our best resource, the faculty and the students who are expert debaters, who can facilitate these very difficult conversations, skills that many of us don't have. And so the debate team, the Barclay Forum, they facilitate a number of very difficult conversations, and they bring students together in a space like this. And you don't get to pick your position. The position is assigned to you, and you have to argue from that perspective. And that's been a source of joy for students, and we know that their learning is increased dramatically. The students also write position pieces in our student newspaper, again, positions that they don't necessarily agree with.
Right.
And that's another sort of passive way for students to engage intellectually with these really difficult issues.
Right. So I think one of the most important things is to remember that in responding as leaders, to remember that it is this sense of authentic community by students, for students, about students, in conversation with you, which is the most important first response. People say, do you respond first, do you get it right? It's actually both. But your most important first response is usually, I think that's what Emory does so well, is that they have somebody whose role it is to be in conversation, to convene students on the issues that are important, to understand in advance what's important to that institution. But the first response is almost always authentic community. And then from there, you work on resolving an issue and having real conversation.
Yeah, we're going to throw to questions,
sure.
I think.
Yeah, let's start with the audience. I've got some questions on my phone, but...
No one has crisis on campus.
Okay. Can we get a mic? Yeah. Thank you, and if you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Shekhar Gade. I'm the Dean of Engineering at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. You know, we academic deans would also like to be engaged, have the pulse of the student body. And so as the Dean of Campus Life, what are the ways you can engage us in that conversation?
Good question.
Absolutely. Actually, that's what's happening at Emory. So it's certainly, it can't be only the obligation of the student affairs colleagues on the campus to build strong relationships with students. That's a disaster if that's all that's happening. But what we've been doing is brokering conversations with the deans, with faculty, with all staff members, with the community, with alumni. Because certainly if students come to me and say, we need to change the curriculum, that's not what I can do, right? And so how do we facilitate conversations with the appropriate parties and help our colleagues understand sort of the student perspective? That's where we can be most helpful. And so that's what we've done at Emory. The working groups that I talked about, they are not run by the student affairs folks at all. We're doing a lot of the sort of background work and setting it up, right? But the faculty are convening the meetings, and they are driving the agenda with the students. So we're merely facilitators, but it's a very important question, and I think the only way you'll have success at your institutions is by creating partnerships across different lines.
That's great. And I saw a hand. Yes, over there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mary Pearl. I'm the Dean of Macaulay Honors College at City University of New York. We have a very lively student body. It has many factions. It's not, one voice speaking. And we have Facebook groups that are private, and they build up a head of steam, sometimes with great misinformation. How do you handle a situation where you have a multiplicity of Facebook private groups that all have their personal perspective and narratives?
Yeah. So certainly it's Facebook. I also add GroupMe has become very popular as another way GroupMe, where students communicate with each other. It's amazing how even though they're private, how quickly we get that information. It's forwarded to us sometimes by the students in the group to draw our attention to it. So nothing's really private in a sense. We all know that. But what we do is when we hear about these situations, we again use our relationships with the students to bring them together. And have a conversation and listen authentically, as Julia said, listen authentically to the concerns and share, at least from our perspective, what the truth is. But it's always fascinating to hear the student perspective on things, and we can't be in a position to dismiss how they feel about it, something, because it's always born out of some truth, right? The way that they're feeling. But to listen authentically and then to develop a shared agenda together is the best way. If you learn about the private post and then you just issue an email, it doesn't work. That doesn't work. You have to have a conversation, get buy-in with the student community, and then issue the response.
So you reach out to someone in that group, maybe?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And that's not always easy to identify, but Emory's a mid-sized institution. It's not impossible to figure out who the right players are. It's also a role, sometimes depending on the strength of your student government, to engage with as well. As you said, you didn't say it exactly in these terms, but the loudest voice tends to win in many situations. How do you involve your student government in partnering with you to address these kinds of concerns as well?
If I can get your quick responses to a couple of questions before we wrap up. How active should college presidents be on Twitter and other social media platforms? Yeah. Because they have nothing else to do.
We have a president who's a tweeter-in-chief, so.
Yeah. I think the interesting answer to that depends entirely on the makeup of the president themselves, because there's some entirely on they have the leadership and the personality where it will never be authentic, and there are others that are just absolute naturals at it. Having said that, in the absence of a university president naturally being engaged online, you can't, on the other hand, overlook the fact that, again, your Gen Z students are assuming that everybody's always talking online all the time. And unless you look for authentic ways to connect with them, they will make assumptions about you that they're probably definitely not true. Favorite story that I have is one where a president who was a admittedly compulsive social media person on Twitter and Yik Yak at the time, didn't we love Yik Yak, and many other platforms. And there was a rising issue on campus where the students were talking both on Twitter and on Yik Yak at the time that they were going to meet at the bridge and march to the president's office first thing in the morning. Checked his Facebook feed, or his Twitter feed and Yik Yak feed the night before. It was about 12:30 at night. Responded back and said, "I'll meet you there." Nice. And he was a new president at the time, and he did, and he walked with them to the library and sat in conversation with them. As a new president, it's a powerful statement to the student body. Now, having said that, some communications officers have said to me, "Oh my gosh, please, we may or may not want that to happen." But having said that, there is a level of authenticity. Did it make the issue go away? No, but then it opened up the ability for those who are directly engaging with students to step in and to further a real, authentic conversation on the issue.
I think the "I'll meet you there" is sort of the key takeaway there. Yeah.
We're running over, but I really want to squeeze in this last question. Over the past 2 years, we as leaders have been called upon to issue statement after statement in response to police shootings, anti-Muslim sentiment, election results, sanctuary campuses, homophobic and racist incidents on and off campus, immigration policy, etc. How should leaders balance the need to be responsive with statement fatigue?
Can you overreact?
Yeah, you can. Well, I think first of all, in listening to many different leaders and how they respond to that, again, it entirely has to do with the makeup of your community. And I will tell you, as we all know, but kind of having the privilege of moving from across the country from large campuses to small, I'm continually struck at the kind of non-monolithic nature of universities and colleges in this country. And it's terrific. It's absolutely terrific. And so part of the key is, I think that part of what these issues are really challenging us to do is to go back to kind of the foundational contract with society that your institution has. Interesting, it's going to be different from a public land-grant university than it might be for a selective liberal arts college. Very, very different makeups of why we're there. So number one, the university presidents, I think, that are navigating this well are recognizing what types of statements might be authentic or reflective of the position of the university and as a natural outcome of the mission or position of that university or college, but not to respond to everything just because it's an issue. I think that seems to be a good line, that there are some issues that absolutely are critical to the mission of the institution. But you have to know what you believe and what you stand for, and we're being called back to that kind of core contract with society, and that's where we spend a lot of time advising university leaders to think and be prepared for these issues.
Ajay, do you have some to add?
At Emory, we have a very flexible protocol. And if you don't have a protocol around how those communications, I would highly recommend it. Just to give you a taste of what it's like, if it's a national sort of global issue, it's most likely the president will respond. If it's more of a local issue, it's probably going to come from me. If it's very school specific, it's going to come from the academic dean of that particular school or college. So there are different ways that, and it's flexible again, right? It may require that we use some different strategy, but it served us well so that there isn't this sort of response fatigue.
Yeah, that's great. Back to you, Kate.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we have lunch next, right?
No, one more presentation.
Sorry, one more panel. But anyway, I would encourage you to continue these. Sorry, no, don't be hungry. But continue these discussions over lunch. Thank you very much.